Go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy to get 20% off your first month of cognitive behavioural therapy, with weekly sessions online with a therapist, in addition to worksheets, a journal, meditation and yoga videos, and unlimited messaging. There's strong evidence that CBT can help people who hoard, and accessing therapy online can be affordable and accessible. Find out more and get your discount at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy.
Here's a cool fact. A crocodile can't stick out its tongue. Another cool fact, you can get short-term health insurance for a month or just under a year in some states. United Healthcare short-term insurance plans are designed for people who are between jobs, coming off their parents' plan, or turning a side hustle into a full-time gig. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, they offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage with access to a nationwide network of doctors and hospitals. Get more cool facts about United Healthcare short-term plans at uh1.com.
Hey there, it's Michelle Norris. I'm host of a podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. When I travel, I'm usually looking for a way to find a taste of home when I'm not at home. And one of the things I love to do when I am at home is entertain. And Airbnb allows me to do that. When I was in California recently, I rented a house that had a great kitchen. And when we were sitting around the table, we were all thinking, we're in someone else's house. Someone could be in all of our homes as well. If you have a home, but you're not always at home, you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Welcome to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder podcast. I am drowning in stuff and trying to find a way out. Listen as I explore the issues and delve deep as somebody profoundly affected by hoarding disorder. Find out more, including links to subscribe to the podcast, at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk, and follow me on Twitter at That Hoarder and on Facebook at facebook.com/That Hoarder. Dr. Jan Eppingstall is a counsellor, researcher and educator with a PhD in psychology, specialising in hoarding disorder and acceptance and commitment therapy. Her website says, "My goal is to help people break the bonds with their belongings, get clear about what's important, and live the life they want." So, Jan, thanks so much for talking to me.
More than happy to have a chat.
So what led you to studying hoarding and ultimately working with people who struggle with hoarding?
Yes, the superhero kind of creation story, if you like. My creation story. It's not that exciting, but I came to hoarding through professional organising, actually. I was about, 2008, and I had two toddlers. I was studying undergrad psychology, and I was kind of looking for a way to kind of make some pocket money. That was my thought. And so I set up a small business. I called it It's Just Stuff, and I did some subcontracting for another experienced PO. And that was when I kind of was confronted with, so many clients who had this extreme reaction to discarding that I'd never contemplated before. So, I had some clients, one who had this faded receipt, like you couldn't actually read anything on the receipt, but she wanted to keep it because it might be important. And there was hundreds of receipts everywhere. And I was kind of thinking, wow, this is fascinating. What's going on here? And, of course, I was at university, so I got into the library and I just went mad, started reading everything I could. The TV shows, I think it started about then. And in the beginning, they kind of had that sort of observational documentary kind of feel, which was quite enlightening. But now they've slipped into, I guess, what lots of people call trauma porn, or, using shock and disgust to entertain. So it's no longer the same. And it's even a little bit, home makeover, which just makes me kind of feel ill. But, yeah, I just kept going. I just kept studying psychology. I made sure I went to a university that had a connection to hoarding, and, ended up finding a supervisor for my PhD who had a connection to hoarding. And I'm still going. I'm still learning, still researching, although not as much, of course, now because of my work with individual clients, but I do still intend to research, although it's not my primary focus anymore.
And I know that you've looked in detail at the links between hoarders and trauma. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that study that we did was part of a bigger study that was looking at kind of the stressful life events, traumatic experiences that might occur to not only hoarders but also a whole bunch of other obsessive compulsive type disorders. And so that was kind of the focus there. And I think there's always been talk within the research field of hoarding that loss and deprivation are kind of a catalyst. Like, we've always been discussing that. Yes. And no one had really done any research around that. So we developed these measures, or this measure that had 5 different types of stressful life events. And I guess the most important bit of information from that was that really we now know that stressful life events involving loss and deprivation that happen before or at the time of the onset of the hoarding was predicted by higher levels of emotional attachment to possessions. And that, I think, is kind of like the most important piece of information that came from that study, because that's, again, what we've constantly been mentioning. There's something about loss and something about, being attached to stuff, and the kind of that compensation, that compensatory effect. And I think that really does tie into that. And, of course, less concerns about remembering important information events because you've kept the stuff, so you feel less concerned, which is not hard to believe. But the other thing is that the loss and deprivation after the onset meant that people had more concerns about memory, but less concerns about control. And that's one. I have no idea on this one. I do not know why that would be the case. I'm wondering if it's purely methodological, that there weren't as many, individual items in that particular area of the measure, but it could be worth looking into. The other thing, of course, is that traumatic events before were predicted by traumatic events after, which is our whole trauma begets trauma kind of cycle, if you like, which I found interesting as well. And again, that's something that is found in many studies, is this whole, the trauma, or, that you become vulnerable if you've had that trauma in your early years. And I guess the reasons for that are, probably what we'll go into in a little bit. You'll get an idea of, how that might happen.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that we see.
Sure.
One other thing I will say, which I kind of feel the need to say, is that most of the research that has been done on hoarding is women. I mean, 90 to 95% of those who actually are the ones who engage in research are women. So that's the first thing. We're looking at, 50% of the population. It is biased, and also the same with my clientele. I mean, my clients are 90% female. So that is, again, something, a lot of the hoarding research is predominantly female. So we can't really generalise across both genders, or and we can't be clear about whether men experience things in the same way.
Sure, that makes sense. So in your professional experience, how common is a history of trauma in people who hoard? Is it almost inevitable, or how does that balance out?
Yeah, look, I in my experience, see it as perhaps ubiquitous. Like, I see trauma, especially if we kind of define it as something that we experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope, that we can't escape or fight, and we feel that kind of helpless hopelessness. I think that, yes, that is the experience of, the people I work with and the people I talk to. And in hoarding, I do think that interpersonal trauma is very, very common, and is kind of that logical vulnerability. Although we've only got one study that kind of says 76% of those experience some sort of interpersonal trauma. So things like domestic abuse, assault, robbery, home invasion, anything person to person, if you like. And of course, loss and deprivation in ours was found to be linked to increased emotional attachment, which is the primary motivator, I guess, for saving and acquiring. But I do feel like if we define trauma in that way of something that overwhelms our capacity to cope, yes, I think it is pretty much a fait accompli for people. But of course, there's all sorts of other intervening variables that are just, whether someone ends up hoarding or using something else to cope, is dependent on other factors.
Sure. And you may have just answered this, but are there particular types of trauma that are more likely to lead to hoarding behaviours?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough one because there hasn't been enough research, and I don't feel like we have at this point in time like a clear picture of why a particular person begins hoarding. I mean, I guess for some researchers that's sort of the final frontier. Like, I think they want to find that, and I did in a way too. Like, when I was looking at this, I was like, there must be some specific thing that really, I just can't find that at the moment, and I can't see that in the research. But I think we need to make a really big leap in our research into epigenetics, which is that nature via nurture research. That is where we will hopefully get to the bottom of it. And we're not there yet. We can't do that sort of thing. And we certainly have done zero longitudinal research, zero studies in hoarding. We haven't looked at individuals from, over 20 years. We haven't done it. So really, causation, very difficult to demonstrate in research unless you've done that.
Yeah.
Longitudinal stuff.
Trauma can mean different things to different people, which fits with what you were saying about the overwhelm thing. Something can happen to 3 people and one may be overwhelmed by it. So what one person experiences as very traumatic can be, experienced as quite minor by someone else. So in the same way, I assume that as one single trauma can manifest in different ways for different people. So is that why some people experience trauma and drink too much? Others start hoarding, others, have depression. Does that match your experience?
Yeah, look, I think with trauma, it is kind of, trauma is something that impacts the central nervous system or the autonomic nervous system, and how that then is expressed in terms of coping mechanisms depends on the individual, and it depends on a couple of things. It depends on life experience. So someone might have a family who they tend to drink. So that tends to be, what the person finds as a way to kind of escape that sort of pain that they're feeling. Another family might hoard. I mean, I've had a discussion with someone who said her mother's family were all alcoholics, and she said, I'm never ever going to be an alcoholic, so she hoards. So it is really just kind of a manifestation of that. And hoarding is very clearly visual. It's a very clear kind of message of trauma, I feel anyway. But who copes better? It's like if someone who has a secure attachment with their primary caregiver, someone who has that attachment security, they're likely to experience a trauma, process that trauma, and then come back to equilibrium and kind of balanced in their life. They'll be able to make sense of it. They'll have someone to support them, and that will then, lead them to continue to grow as an individual. And that attachment security with our primary caregiver is really important, and it's important in the development of our nervous system resilience. So body and mind, when a child is growing up, body and mind are developing at the same time. So securely attached kids, they're helped by their primary caregiver to regulate their emotions, which is a really important thing. Like we always co-regulate as individuals. And without that kind of lesson learnt as a young baby, with eye contact, with, all of that interaction, we don't feel safe and secure. So that is one of the core things about secure attachment. And then children use their secure attachment as a base to explore stuff. I'll go out and I'll learn things. And the caregiver is also able to repair ruptures. If there's a problem, if they do something, I don't know, if they smack the child or whatever, or say a nasty word, they know how to repair that. So, that's 2/3 of the population. And they're able to kind of come back from trauma. But you've got the 1/3, which are, the insecurely attached. So they might have a primary caregiver that isn't available or rejecting, lacks warmth, preoccupied, or they might be the opposite. They might be over-involved or authoritarian, really punitive. They can, depending on their personality traits, they can either become avoidantly attached, so they'll be shut down emotionally, self-reliant, standoffish, have shallow kind of romantic relationships, or they'll be anxiously attached, which is needy and seeking closeness, fearing rejection, abandonment, people-pleasing, enmeshment, all those kinds of really clingy kind of personality traits. But then there's the third type, which is implicated specifically or has been found in the research to relate directly to PTSD, and that is disorganised attachment. I don't know if you've heard about that, but there's an extreme fear of rejection, and trusting others is extremely difficult. And that whole idea of needing closeness but also wanting to push other people away. So it's that kind of dialectic, the opposites at exactly the same time. I love you, don't leave me, get away from me kind of stuff. And that's usually the result of interpersonal trauma. So a child might have been raised in an emotionally, physically abusive household. The primary caregiver was the source of abuse. So that means that that person who should be their rock is the one who is perpetrating the abuse. So, and it also might be a home with a mentally ill caregiver, especially one who has a personality disorder or one of the OCD type disorders, because there's this kind of preoccupation and difficulty dealing with their own stuff that they can't then allow the child to develop all of these things that we need to develop as children. So, the person in a disorganized attachment, really the individual state dictates their story. So how they feel in their body is then projected out. So like they live in a kind of position of hypervigilance. They'll see more people as threats. They'll interpret danger where there isn't any. They'll see faces that to us would be pretty neutral. They'll see them as aggressive. Body language of others' language, because it'll be filtered through, and this is something we'll talk probably a little bit later on about the more primitive parts of the brain and how that is impacted in, how trauma relates to that. But, it's like the homeless person, you're walking along and they shout at you, "What are you looking at?" aggressively. It's like, this is their safety system going bling, 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 bling. You've just made fleeting eye contact, but they see that as hostile. So that's something that, the trauma that they've experienced is then shaping who they've become and who they continue to be because of the way it manifests. And the story that they've created to, I guess, explain their state of how they feel, if that makes sense. I mean, it's a lot of it's fascinating. The whole attachment stuff is just amazing, and what we know now about attachment is helping the whole kind of area of trauma advance significantly.
Absolutely. It seems like it's core to everything, doesn't it?
Yeah. So Freud wasn't technically wrong in his book. I often say like Freud wasn't completely wrong. But it's fascinating, and we know so much more about the physical impacts on a child, a baby, but also prenatally. I mean, there's so much information about prenatal and how you can actually predict a child's attachment style prenatally. So you interview the mother and it's pretty bang on. It's pretty bang on. And that's due to the physical, the release of cortisol and all those other kind of neurotransmitters and things that actually will impact, that will go directly to the baby, Yeah. So Freud wasn't wrong.
On that.
On that. On that. Exactly. Oh, dear.
Can you explain the difference between big T traumas and little t traumas and how that might relate to people with hoarding disorder?
Yeah. And before I go on with that, I mean, those aren't necessarily clinical terms, but I think big T trauma tends to be what people think of when you say trauma, like the general population. You say trauma and they think rape, car accident, violent death of a family member, war, sort of, I mean, war really isn't one, but you know what I mean, like an event or a situation. And that's what they imagine. And that is what's being referred to in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual when they talk about PTSD. That's what it's one big event that forever changes someone's life.
Yeah.
But small T trauma are all those little things that happen to us and accumulate over time. So interpersonal trauma, like we talked about before, childhood neglect, abuse, caregivers that hurt rather than protect, growing up with emotionally immature parents who rely on you rather than protect you, mentally ill parents or siblings, all these sorts of things, these little small T traumas kind of accumulate and almost form kind of like a weighted blanket that covers someone and almost disables them in a way because they can't see, they're no longer hopeful about their future and they feel trapped and helpless. And even when the situation changes often, things change, and even, I don't know, like say a parent might pass and, you know, they're in inverted commas free, but they can't see that the barrier's gone, and you've got that learned helplessness. And that it can be quite baffling for people to say, but you can do all these things now. And that's often called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. That's what we kind of use. We use that term to talk about that, although it's not in the DSM. It's not specified. I think it should have been. Bessa van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, which you probably know about, he was pushing for it to be a separate, this more interpersonal kind of complex post-traumatic stress, but it didn't happen in the last review. So maybe in the next one. But it also comes with additional symptoms that I think are important to note, like strong feelings of shame and guilt, because it's a trauma that's often happened, within a family or within, an adult and a child. So there's that huge shame and guilt there. I think it was my fault. I think I caused this to happen, which doesn't happen so much with accidents and, all those other kinds of things. You don't blame yourself so much. Emotion regulation issues is really big. So struggling with regulating your emotions and periods of dissociation. So if you have, that kind of blanking out, kind of not really being, hovering above yourself, that's, I think dissociation is on a continuum, really. I mean, there are low levels of dissociation that we all kind of do. We all zone out. We just, I'll just sit here and watch a TV show I've watched 50 times. That's one form. And in a way that might be actually that might be a positive way to use dissociation. But then you've got, periods of, really like cutting off from your experience and your body. And that can be significantly detrimental. And I think I've had a client who doesn't remember, like dropping papers and things all around. Like she'll not wake up, but almost become aware that there's all, she's just been reading the mail and it's just all ended up around her. And it's like, but how did that happen? I don't remember that happening. And I think that's something that does impact hoarding for sure. And I think this whole small T trauma is really what we're seeing now as being the thing that hoarding is a result of. And again, research probably won't be able to tell us that for many, many years. But as a clinician, that's what I see.
Sure.
That's what I experience.
You have an email newsletter, which, frankly, everybody listening should subscribe to because it's great.
Thank you. Please, the more the merrier. I love writing it. I love it.
And so I'm just going to read something that you put in one of them. And in this particular bit, you were speaking to fellow practitioners. You said, how many of your clients' eyes glaze over when you attempt to talk them through logical reasons to part with objects they're attached to? How many of your clients say they feel like they have a brick in their heads that they can't get past? How many of your clients describe collapsing after your session, unable to do anything for days afterwards? Now, for me, I can definitely relate to all of those, but the final one in particular. I do this stuff and then get so overwhelmed that my brain just goes, nope. And that's that. So
Exactly.
So what's the significance of those responses? Would you say?
Okay. So this all relates to kind of the polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve, as well as our central nervous system. It all relates to that. So what you've just described there, the brick, the glaze over, the collapse, is what I affectionately call, and lots of people call, turtle mode. And that's the trauma response in the body. It's this hypoarousal, which is under-arousal of the nervous system. And it's a dissociation where the mind and the body kind of separate in order to survive a life threat. So you are feeling in your body that decluttering, de-hoarding, letting go of things is actually life-threatening to you, because that's how you have lived. That's how your system is kind of triggered. It's set up. It's like on a hair trigger. So anything that comes about that is stressful, you may slip into fight a little, but then you'll drop right down into that it's just shut down.
Yeah.
It's just, that's it. I can't do anything now. And the important thing to remember about that, and I tell my clients this, it's not a defect. It's not something that is wrong with you. You are not lazy. You are not, you are not unable to change. It is, it's a survival state that in your life experience, that was what you used in order to survive the environment, whatever it might be that has occurred in your life. And it's become the default. So whenever something comes up that that you feel is kind of life-threatening, it will be shut down. So really, I mean, what can be done about that? And there are things that can be done about that. And it's this whole concept of the mind-body connection that has been missing from our psychological treatment and therapy for a very long time. I mean, we mostly rely on, the numbers are staggering, that we rely on medication over therapy, because we want a quick fix. We think the drugs, we've always been told drugs and therapy, that's the way to do it. But most people now are just on the drug bandwagon and they just go, yep, the drugs will help. Only 33% of people improve when they take an antidepressant or whatever it might be. But what we're finding now, and what the polyvagal theory and all of these kind of what they call interpersonal neurobiology peeps, your Bessel van der Kolks, your Peter Levines, Daniel Siegel, all these people are looking at what's happening in the body and working on ways to treat that. It's very easy. I don't know about you, but a lot of clients that I work with have no real necessarily awareness of their body. Like, they can't describe what's happening in their body. And that's significant. Like, that's something that needs to be, worked on in therapy, because I think it's hard to explain without going back to kind of talk about the whole polyvagal science of safety, because I think if you understand kind of how the brain and then connects with the rest of the body, that will help with understanding this turtle mode and processing trauma and all those other things. So polyvagal theory is the science of safety. So it's the way the autonomic nervous system reacts to experiences and regulates our responses to those experiences. And the first thing we probably need to do is look at the brain in kind of a simplified way, not in a really, I'm not a neuroscientist, so it's just a caveat. So don't take any bets on anything that I've told you. Let's see if I can do it justice. But the brain evolved in 3 stages. So the first stage was the brainstem and the cerebellum, and that's right at the base of the brain at the back. That's your ancient part of your brain, and that is often called lizard or turtle brain. And it regulates heartbeat, breathing, organ function. And its basic need is safety and avoidance. So that is where you go when you feel life threat. Then the subcortical regions, which is I don't know if you know about the hand model of the brain.
No.
This is the brain. It's brilliant. This is the brain stem. This is going to really go well on radio. This is the brainstem, and then your thumb crossing over your palm, that is the subcortical region, the limbic system, and that is known as the mammalian brain. That's the mouse brain, and it's the seat of emotions, memory, learning, reward, motivation. And it wants to feel satisfaction and it wants to approach rewards. That's what it's all about. Then once you close the hand and the actual fingers is the cortex, which is the primate brain, the human part. Like that's where all that's the most recently developed or evolved part of our brain.
Yeah.
And that regulates our attention, our feelings, reasoning, planning, language, empathy, all of those things that make us who we are. And it wants connection and attachment. That's what it's looking for. It's seeking that out in its environment. So turtle needs safety, mouse needs satisfaction, primate needs connection. So that's what the brain's doing. Now, the vagus nerve comes from the brain stem and it kind of wanders. It's actually a bunch of nerves, but we call it one nerve. But it wanders through the body and connects with vital organs. And it's divided into two parts. So from the diaphragm up is the ventral vagus, and that connects with your heart, your lungs, your larynx. And from down, the diaphragm down, is the dorsal vagus, which connects your stomach, liver, spleen, digestive system. So keep that in mind as we go through. Think about the digestive system and stuff as we move on. Then you have the sympathetic nervous system, which is the spinal nerve. And that helps regulate our heartbeat and our breath and all that kind of stuff. And it works in concert with the ventral vagal to bring energy to daily activities and get us to connect. It's what makes us move. So when something's dangerous in our environment, our survival response is triggered. And that's something that we're not consciously aware of that. It's something called neuroception that happens in the body, and it's much quicker than our brain reacts. So like your gut instinct kind of stuff. And when that happens, survival response, cortisol, adrenaline pumps through the body so we can mobilize. We can flee. We can, our heart races, we hyperventilate. That's our fight-flight response, okay? And at this point, we're still connected to the cortex. So we still have a way of thinking and planning and making decisions in that moment. But if our perception or our neuroception is that the stimulus is life-threatening, we can't see a way to escape, we shift into this dorsal vagal state where we disconnect, shut down, try to be invisible, dissociate. And you may sometimes, I don't know about, and I know it happens to many people, happens to me sometimes, is, the stomach, like the feeling in the tummy, like churning. So that's what I believe. That's what as I said before, that's what's happening when they go to discard, sort, or organise. The cortex is offline and they can't make rational decisions. They actually can't decide. So they're not just being difficult. They're not being difficult. They're right. But if they've slipped right down into turtle mode, they have to go back up through, back up to ventral vagal. It's not, you can't skip a spot. It's very kind of primitive in that way. Like you have to go through the stages. And I think that's where we need to work. That's something that is not in any of the treatment that I've read or looked at regarding hoarding. That is not there. And I think that is kind of a core sort of piece for me, for what I'm doing now, my work now, is I'm realising that is the piece that's missing, is looking at how we can help people get from that, dorsal, they're down in turtle mode, they've been in turtle mode for 2-3 days, they can't get out of bed. What can we teach them to bring them back out? And most of it is, most of these things, these techniques are about the body, breath, they're about mindfulness, they're about observation of the body and what's happening in your own body. And that can be quite confronting for some people, but that is kind of the only way to get to know what's happening, is finding out, actually observing yourself and stopping and going, okay, that's what's happening. I can feel it happening in my body. What can I describe that? Because if you're feeling like you're slipping into dorsal vagal or turtle mode, if you catch yourself before you slip too far, you can actually that's the sweet spot where you learn and you can work out how to deal with it. You can say, okay, this is how I feel, because you're still semi-connected to your cortex. So you can actually describe it. But the second you slip right down, I mean, therapy's not dangerous at that point. It's just pointless.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like me talking to someone and saying, well, what about this idea? How about the rationale for keeping it? No rational thought is happening. And they're just going, no. And that's why everyone who hoards says this, I'm overwhelmed. And that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's a slip down. And if we can help people manage that, I think, and I'm not saying it's a panacea and it will be like magic, but I do think that there is a path, there is a way through to kind of, I don't like the word recovery, but you know what I mean, to a path through to feeling more in control and more confident in how you live, in your space. But I do think that whole thing, under-arousal, that hypo-arousal thing, is what I was seeking out in my research when I did my PhD. That was kind of what with my acceptance and commitment therapy kind of stuff, I kind of created this new model of what happens when people are discarding. And the little missing piece, I was calling it experiential avoidance, is what ACT calls it, which is basically kind of the same thing. It's the same kind of thing. It's being unable to experience any of those feelings, sensations. It's technically the same thing, but this is kind of more of a. I find people accept this more because it has like a bodily, it's kind of more acceptable to people to feel like it's a bodily and a safety mechanism, which is exactly what it is. It's not, I'm not trying to dress up, just something that it's not. But I do find people feel like they have this, they have a bit more control over their path forward if they know that it's something in their body and that they can, they can work through it. Yeah.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
A lot can happen in the next 3 years. Like a chatbot may be your new best friend. But what won't change? Needing health insurance. United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans are available for these changing times. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, they offer budget-friendly, flexible coverage for people who are in between jobs or missed open enrollment. The plans last nearly 3 years in some states, with access to a nationwide network of doctors and hospitals. So for whatever tomorrow brings, United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans may be for you. Learn more at uh1.com.
Thinking about trauma, would you say that there's a benefit in having trauma therapy before embarking on trying to deal with the hoarding specifically, or can it be done in conjunction?
That's an interesting question because it depends on what type of trauma therapy you're thinking of. If you're thinking of, some sort of
EMDR,
that type of stuff. I don't know. I think how I would approach it, or how I do approach it, is I work with individuals first up to kind of understand how they feel when they approach this particular process of discarding or or even just simply sorting. So I don't feel, there's a little bit of misperception about trauma, and that it has to be processed before you can recover or whatever. And, people think, I can relive it in my mind and then it will just go away. But it's not in the mind, it's in the body. And so it's a different different thing to do to process as it is to relive it. Going into the minutiae of what might have happened to you in fine detail will probably see you slip down into dorsal vagal, and you won't be able to understand what's happening. You'll just dissociate. It's not going to help. But processing is about catching it before you drop too far down, being able to describe what's happening in your body.
Yeah.
And then, if you can catch it there, you can talk it through with your counsellor or your therapist. And that's a beginning point in order to, just kind of stretch your window of tolerance for how much distress you can cope with, because life is distressing. Everything's distressing. But if we try to go too quickly, too fast, we give up. But we just need to kind of stretch that window of tolerance a little bit. And then once it's open enough, you will be able to tolerate more distress, more distress, basically, because we think we want to avoid distress, but avoiding distress actually makes the distress more distressing, and then it just blows up. But I do think that the hoarding treatment at the moment needs to kind of evolve, and it needs to have more of this mindfulness, somatic kind of acceptance and commitment therapy kind of work, because traditional CBT doesn't work if you slipped into dorsal vagal, because you can't use here, you can't connect. Cognitive behavioural therapy is about using cognitions to make rational decisions about, putting things into piles and all of that. It's just not going to work. It's not going to work. And I think we need to forget about the schools of therapy and just try and find what works for the journey of the individual. But I think if a person has a trauma background, then that needs to be kind of the first port of call. Yeah. Definitely, because it's not going to. It's not something you can kind of push aside. Unless you can grit your teeth, you know what I mean? Unless you can grit your teeth through things, and use you're using your willpower rather than, some people can push through things and use their willpower and get to the other side. People who lose massive amounts of weight and do all this, they push themselves with willpower, but it's not sustainable. It's not something you can sustain. And some people try to do that with hoarding. If I can push through it, but all of the same things come up later, and they're there, They're there when you have nothing, and they're there when you have everything. So,
it's interesting. I had some CBT last year, and it was, in this country at the moment, CBT is prescribed is the answer to everything. I think because it's quite cheap and time limited, it's what everybody gets referred to first. And I found it genuinely helpful in the sense of sitting with something in front of me and not having a clue how to make a decision. That kind of thing was great. It was also great for making me question, like I would go, okay, I'm going to do some tidying up in the kitchen. Then I would walk into the kitchen and go, nope, and walk out again. And doing the CBT made me go, okay, what is that nope? Is it an overwhelmed nope? Is it and once I knew what I was dealing with, I was more able to say, okay, that's an overwhelmed nope. So what can we do to reduce the overwhelm? That kind of thing. It was genuinely useful for, but it didn't address some other types of nope, it was,
Yes.
So it was genuinely helpful, but I agree with you that I wouldn't say it is the solution, full stop.
Yeah. And it's the same in Australia. CBT is very much, it's a prescribed treatment.
Yeah.
And we love the reason it is the reason that happens is because people have created these modules, a prescribed way of going through the process for each individual type of disorder.
Yeah.
So you have a manual for everything. And there's so many weeks, and that was how the research was done, because it's very difficult to attempt to ascertain the results from my therapy versus someone else's therapy if I'm not following.
Yeah.
And that's why I came about.
Yeah.
And I think now the researchers, it takes something like 17 years before something that's been researched gets into common knowledge. So it's going to be a while before we realise this. But the people who actually have developed CBT have kind of gone, yeah, there's bits that work and there's bits that don't. Yeah. So now there's this whole process-based cognitive behavioural therapy that is emerging, and that is around what are the actual therapy techniques that work, what do they work with, what types of thought processes, what are the kernels that actually make change happen. That's all we care about. And now that's coming around. And so everyone's just going, let's not call it CBT. You're going to use this process-based term, and it's got bits from everywhere. But I don't know how governments are going to handle that, because they like things in boxes, and they like things to be 12 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever, which is difficult. But CBT is the same here, and everyone wants to be prescribed, everyone wants to prescribe that. But just going through the motions with a client, just following the manual is just just a waste of money for the government as well. That's really the problem. But there are really good things about it. Don't get me wrong. Full on, there's heaps of techniques and tricks like that thing you just described. That's kind of tapping into what I was talking about. That's tapping into what sort of nope is it?
Yeah.
How do I feel? Where is it coming from? That is exactly the sort of thing. Yeah. But it's kind of got a different wrapper. But it's and we're trying to do away with it. We're trying to go a bit generic, We're trying to do away with the wrappers a little bit and just be, well, what is it that actually works? Yeah. And focus in on that. So fingers crossed in 17 years everyone will start.
I look forward to it.
I'll be gone by then. Probably I'll be on. No, I don't know. But it's just frustrating.
So from another one of your email newsletters, you said, some people with a significant amounts of chaotic stuff in their homes have described the feeling of being in a burrow, cocooned and safe. And many practitioners suggest moving very slowly, discarding so that the client can get accustomed to the open spaces created in the home. Even moving at a glacial pace can shut people down. Now, again, this is something that stood out because I could completely relate to that kind of feeling of safety in being surrounded by stuff. How can that kind of thing be addressed?
Well, that's links in with this whole safety system and feeling like you can feel safe with someone who's a therapist or with other people and connect. And you can, by doing these sorts of activities or working on being able to kind of recognize and label and, talk about how you're feeling, that can slowly give you that sense of safety and it will slowly feel comfortable as you open out. It's the same sort of thing as your tolerance, you know, just stretching the tolerance slowly, slowly, slowly. The other option is you can, and I've said this to people, it depends on the space you've got, you can keep a little cocoon. What's wrong with that? Who says? Who says you can't have your little cocoon? I mean, I actually find nowadays we live in these open plan homes, and I long for the days where we had a TV room and it was all cozy and everyone would have to snuggle in there and squish up, you know, because it was safe and comfortable. We want to be in these open spaces. Well, not everybody needs or wants that. So having a little cocoon somewhere where you really feel safe and comfortable, and then having other spaces where you've got a bit more room to kind of do the activities that you want to do, because that's what I find. That's where it's problematic, because so many people I work with have so many creative things that they enjoy doing, and they just can't seem to let go of enough in order to gain back the space to do the things they really enjoy. And that's, again, I mean, the other thing I've talked a little bit about in my newsletter is around values and what is it that's really important to you. And if you can drill down and get your top 5 values, and the top one, you know, if you have children, it's my family, well, then really someone needs to sacrifice something in order to achieve and live on those values. But values just drive you in ways that goals and things can't. And I do find that does really help people kind of focus in, even when they get to that point where they go, I don't know what the hell to do. I've got all this. What are my values? What do I want out of my life? What do I want people to say about me? You know, what in my eulogy? It's confronting, but do I want people to say that I was a generous person who invited me over for scones and, you know, blah, blah, blah? Or I wasn't quite sure who lived there. You know, I mean, I just feel like that is a good way to kind of come out of that. But that whole idea of having to have the entire house, you know, in some way that's sort of acceptable, no. If you want to have a little cocoon, I strongly recommend you do that.
I see a trend recently where a lot of people are claiming that their work is trauma-informed. It's a bit of a buzzword, whether it's yoga teacher, life coach, therapist. And it seems that, first of all, it would be great if, you know, people in all these sectors are genuinely trauma-informed. But I worry that people are using it as a buzzword and maybe claiming it while not being fully prepared or informed, which I worry could actually be dangerous. And so it's clear through your work that you are genuinely trauma-informed and you encourage other practitioners to be the same. Do you have any thoughts on, I'm thinking people looking for help, how they can establish whether somebody read an article and therefore claimed to be trauma-informed, you know, or whether it's a genuine built-in factor?
Yeah. Look, I think, and it has become a bit of a buzzword. But I'm quite glad that it's being talked about and recognised as a factor in people's lives, because it's just something that has been overlooked so widely that I feel people who have had these sorts of traumatic experiences feel like they need to hide and not talk about it. And I'm happy that it is now being talked about. But I think it really is kind of an ethos, a way of approaching your therapy and having, you know, always considering your verbal and non-verbal communications and how that might land with a client. Or, you know, it's knowing how to help people tolerate the emotions that might come up. What I do find often is that counsellors are scared of trauma. And they may be scared of trauma because they haven't done the work. They may be scared of trauma because they're worried they won't be able to cope with what comes up, whatever. But they will avoid triggers at all costs. But that's not the answer either, because the person's not going to, not going to grow by avoiding those. So I think that's really hard. I mean, being trauma-informed is is treating everyone who comes through your door as a trauma, as a potential trauma survivor. Like, it's not going, I think you are, I think you're not. It's everyone has an individual story, and there's a chance that there'll be something there in everybody that, will come up because you're in a very intimate relationship with this person. So it's understanding the symptoms of trauma, the shame, the emotion dysregulation, the dissociation that come along with all of that, and understanding the types of experiences that might traumatize the person. It's about asking them if they feel, tell me if you feel unsafe. I think that, you want to be asking questions with that in mind. Are you comfortable to continue? You don't need to reveal everything that's happened to you if that's too much. Open up in your own time, those sorts of things. Forcing people to open up and tell you every minute detail is re-traumatizing. I mean, and making them repeat it over and over again, that is just not helping. But it's also about psychoeducation, I think, for clients, like explaining the basis of trauma-informed treatment so they know what's happening and how the sessions will kind of progress, and building in that safety factor. Like, I think I've said it to people before, if you feel the person if you feel this clinician isn't the right person for you or the right fit, and they don't ask you if you feel safe, find someone else. Rely on your gut instinct, because that's actually your safety system reacting. It's going, I don't feel safe with this person. You have every right to just say, look, I'm really, I'm happy that I met you, but really, always seeking out someone who's a member of an association and all that kind of stuff. If you're trying to assess whether someone's trauma informed, I mean, you can ask them about what type of training they've done and what sort of, what would be your process of working with me? And you can find out pretty quickly on the phone if you think that they understand what that's about. But a good therapist will ask to come to your home regardless. They'll want to come to your home. They'll want to see you in your own environment, and you will feel safe with them. And safe doesn't mean they're nice, and it doesn't mean that they smile a lot. And it means that in your body, you feel safe with that person.
Yeah.
That, because they are, for many people, they are the first person that you'll create this kind of safe bond, safe relationship with, in order to then use that blueprint to go and make further relationships in your life, if that's something that you're struggling with, which often is the case with hoarding and trauma and all of those sorts of things. But, I think a good therapist will regardless want to come and see you in your home. Even if you're not a hoarder, I think I would want to come and see someone in their own home environment, and just to see how they feel outside of the office, because the office can be very just bland and generic, and often people don't react in the same way, especially hoarding. It's not the same. You can talk the talk when you're not in connection with the hoard. You could say, oh, I'm fine. Oh, yes, I do know that I need to do these things. And then you come up to it and it's like, I can't let go of this one tiny item.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I do think educate yourself about what trauma-informed therapy is. Have a bit of a look on the internet. And, if you can find someone who has some trauma experience and some understanding of mindfulness practices, it's a good start. I would never recommend a life coach. Yoga's a different concept, because they have inbuilt quite strong trauma-informed kind of practices, and it is actually quite effective. But you want to watch out for people who are, I don't like it when the yoga instructor touches people, that worries me. You know, those sorts of things. They don't ask. You know, that's not trauma informed in my world. You know, I need to ask that person, is it okay if I was a yoga teacher? All those sorts of things. But I do think that, you know, life coach, you don't need any qualifications for that. I just would be very, very, very wary about anyone along those lines who says they can help. And I mean, professional organising a little bit as well. And I don't want to, I mean, I've done the job and all that sort of thing, but I do think it needs to be done in conjunction with a therapist, I think. I mean, I like the idea of being a team and having, you know, the therapist doing all of this trauma-informed work, and then the professional organiser assisting with the knowledge of where you're at in your therapy in the home, doing the hands-on stuff. That would be my preference for people, if they can afford it.
Well, that leads to my next question, actually. If somebody is unable to access professional support for the time being, maybe for financial reasons, maybe nobody local is suitable, what would you suggest they do to help themselves in the meantime?
I think it's a really good question, because there's not a lot out there that's sort of self-help that I would recommend, really. Yeah. I've spoken about it recently, and I just kind of said there's a lot of relevant information, but it hasn't been brought together to really give people the background. And that's kind of, I suppose, what I'd like to do if I could stop procrastinating. I'd like to build, and I do intend to build a short course where people can get their head around this kind of polyvagal, trauma-informed stuff, just so that they can get started. Yeah. So if before that happens, soak up all the free resources you can about hoarding and interpersonal neurobiology and polyvagal, all that sort of stuff, acceptance and commitment therapy. Sign up to my newsletter. Come and join the Facebook groups and things like that. Hoarding disorder research groups, Stuffology, all that sort of stuff. Read, but also do. Because I know often there's a propensity for us, us perfectionists, which includes all of us hoarders, that we will we will read before we do, because I haven't quite read enough. You know, it's like doing a PhD and you've read 50 million articles and you haven't written a word. You know, do as you go and try things out, and journal. I can't recommend that highly enough. Write about how you feel in your body when you've tried things and what happened. You know, take a perspective of curiosity, which I think is really important in trauma-informed work, is be curious about what's happening in your body and in your mind as you're doing things, and catch yourself when you feel yourself putting yourself down, and catch yourself when you're saying, "Oh, you idiot, you're lazy." I'm having the thought that I'm lazy. Distance yourself from those things. Catch those thoughts and distance. And those, when you shut down, when you have those shutdowns, that's your safety switch. And that worked in the past. It doesn't serve you now. Times have changed. So realizing that, and I can't exaggerate more. Try things out. Do little experiments every day, slowly, carefully pushing those boundaries of what you can tolerate, etc. And track your progress. Make sure that you can see how you're going with all these things, because it's very common to look over and go, "Oh, it's exactly the same." No, you know, I've spent 3-4 days on this and now, you know, it's exactly the same. Well, it's not exactly the same, but you can do it. You know, it can be done. There is hope, and you have to really start today.
The curiosity thing is interesting. Again, when I had the CBT, she used to frame things as not this week you're going to do X, Y, and Z. She would say, let's do an experiment and then see how it goes. And then if it works, great. And if it doesn't, we'll work that out next week. And I found it so much less pressure to think, I'm not getting however many bags out of the house. I'm doing an experiment. And so it didn't matter. If it didn't work, I hadn't failed. It was just that we hadn't got it, and I found that so effective.
Yeah. It is so effective coming from that angle of curiosity about what's happening. And I do it when I'm working with people, like I said earlier, that whole 360-degree view of a situation. I can see what that person might be thinking, and that it's the same how you're dealing with, your progress on your journey. Oh, that's so weird that happened. Oh, wonder why. And pondering and doing a bit of journaling and just kind of, there's no need to feel like you failed, because the only way you will improve is by failing or by trying things out and finding what works. And if it doesn't work, move on to the next thing. It's the curiosity. I often think to myself, curiosity, Jan, not judgment. What's you come from that place, because I do think it is really it's a shift, and it's quite a big shift for many people, but I do think it works.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. Honestly, this is so valuable, such great information. If people want to find you online, where can they do so?
They can find me everywhere. I'm on Facebook at Stuffology Consulting, I think I am. On Instagram, I'm at Stuff_ology, and same on Twitter. My website, stuffology.com.au. Sign up for the newsletter there. It comes out weekly on a Sunday afternoon in, Melbourne time. And I've just been doing a decision-making series, but I'm going to move back onto more discarding and working on that kind of stuff next. So come and find me. I love a chat.
I will put all those links in the show notes on the website if anybody missed them. And I honestly recommend signing up for the email newsletter in particular. It's so valuable every week. Yeah, it's great. So thanks again. I appreciate it a lot.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
In just 1 second, I'll give you my top tip of the week. In the meantime, please do subscribe to the podcast, review it, 5 stars would be amazing, and share it with your friends or anyone who might be interested or who might benefit from it. It all really helps. To find out more ways to support the website, the podcast, and my overall de-hoarding project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Now back to your top tip. So my top tip this week is about getting started. Often it's really hard to get moving when you know that the task ahead is going to be a tough one. So something that can be useful, rather than just trying to talk yourself into it, is instead to use alarms. Set an alarm on your phone to go off at 10 a.m. every day or 6 p.m. every day, or whatever time you want to use to de-hoard your home. Sometimes having that prompt from something external rather than just you saying, oh, I really should get started, is effective. And these days, you don't even just have to have your phone beep. You can tell whether you use Alexa or Siri to tell you to start work. It's 6 o'clock, time to start work. Or you can even tell it to turn music on. So you can say at 7 o'clock every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, start playing 80s pop. And that's your prompt, and it's lively and it will get you moving. It's all worth a try. I hope that's helpful to you. Thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you next week. Thank you for listening to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. You can find more online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at @thathoarder and on Facebook at Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, Go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to this podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes.